The energy of an avalanche is just, you have absolutely no idea. Once you're in there, it just takes you. All I could think about was hitting a tree. 120 kilometers an hour, hitting a tree. It would not be, would not end well for me.
Without a doubt, I relied too heavily on the guide. Through my lack of experience in the backcountry, I did not have that spidey sixth sense that I was in trouble or in a dangerous situation.
It was 2 seconds later. I was down in the block, and it was dark and like being in a washing machine spinning around.
I knew the slope I was on and how high I was and how far I was going to slide, and I was just going so fast that I thought, there is no way I can survive this.
My whole world had collapsed. The love of my life was dead.
Oh, the backcountry is special. I mean, at any time, just being able to get out in nature and the silence of it, to be able to commune.
It's just a beautiful place to be. I feel grounded when I'm in the mountains.
We were a group of 10 friends from Canmore, Alberta. We have a shared passion for pursuing activities in the mountains, and in particular, backcountry skiing was something we were all enjoying together.
Our group definitely was at different stages. We had some very confident, experienced skiers that ski powder with great confidence. I'm a very good skier, but I don't have that same confidence skiing in powder. I need a couple of days under my belt to build up that confidence.
Mitch, Jenny, and I were are very strong skiers, so the idea was to have the ability to have bigger, longer days.
It was a week-long backcountry ski touring trip at a backcountry hut, and we had hired a guide and a tail guide and also a cook.
The trip was pretty much organized for us, and so, which is a great thing. The flip side of that was we didn't really do much trip prep as far as really understanding a lot of the dynamics. We'd never met the guide before, so we didn't question anything about his background. He'd been with the group for the previous 2 years, so we just sort of jumped in with both feet, so to speak.
They had had great confidence, and they had had a great time with him before, and really they just included us, as friends.
I was basing this trip on my past experience, and I was blinded by that expectation that he was going to keep me safe and out of harm's way.
This was the first time we'd all been to this specific hut. It was just outside Golden, BC, and it's in the Esplanade range of the Selkirk Mountains. We had a group of 13 that day because we had a guide, a tail guide, the 10 of us from Canmore, and then the custodian from the hut that joined us for this run.
We did an orientation and a couple of runs just behind the lodge. Very pleasant day, beautiful weather. It was just blue sky, a killer day. We didn't really know where we were going to ski except for that initial target. We didn't actually have a morning meeting, which the guide had told us the previous night we would have. So we really weren't that tuned in.
The start of the day was, in my mind, a little bit disorganized, but it had also been disorganized the day before.
While you're climbing, you're in your own headspace. I didn't question where we were going, and that was wrong. We
had kind of checked out mentally because we had hired a guide, and we had pretty much just handed over that responsibility to him. And we left the lodge around 9 in the morning, and with the objective of trying to ski a south-facing aspect. We quickly realized that there was a significant sun crust developed on that aspect from the day before. So we continued to skin up that face, and with the objective changing to ski the north side of that ridge. So as we were approaching the top of the ridge, there was some analysis done by our guide. He dug at least one snow pit, and that gave him some confidence that we could proceed to this run called Hogzilla.
I never saw any of the conversation that went on with the snow pit because we were behind. Carolyn, Sheila, and I were at the back as per normal. We were very, chit-chatting, doing our little girl talk on the way up. And so I was a little bit uncertain where we were going, but it didn't send off any triggers to me at that point.
Hogzilla was a very long, effectively it was an avalanche chute that people do ski under the right conditions.
So when the guide gave us brief instructions that there was a feature to avoid, and we couldn't see over the top, as it was basically a convexity whereby it just kind of fell off, and extremely steep whereby you just couldn't see it. It just fell off into nothingness.
And that's when it first really triggered in me that this is not somewhere that I'm comfortable to, skin off.
So you knew it was steep, and you knew it was a feature, and he said, I'll lay a track, you ski to my right.
I didn't recognize that this slope was way beyond where I should be. I mean, the first full run of our first day of skiing, and I was going down a run that I would only have done after having put 5 or 6 days under my belt. I was way in over my head.
I really wasn't thinking too much about too much concern. In fact, I was a little bit too carefree. That day we were skiing without a helmet. It was a beautiful day. It was warm, and that was a real miss on my part.
And we started to ski this slope one at a time, and there was a regrouping partway down, probably 40% of the way down this avalanche chute. We had a group of 8 at the regrouping spot. Unfortunately, they were not in a safe position. We had 2 people continuing to ski below the regrouping spot, and we had 2 people skiing above the regrouping spot, and only 1 person safely in the trees.
And so I skied up out of the gully into the bench, and the trees might have been, about 2-3 meters tall. Much taller trees, but there was, probably about a 3+ meter base. So I felt I was in the protection. And it really wasn't until 2/3 of the group were down that I started getting really uncomfortable, a really very uncomfortable feeling. People weren't skiing up and out onto the bench where I was. They were actually stopping on the side hill. And as every person came, the next person stopped below them, sort of almost in uniform. Doug came down about that time. I yell at Doug. I look up, and there's a break line, like just a puff cloud about 60 meters across, right on the crown of the convexity. And when we say convexity, it means that the slope is non-supported. The snow has no real support unto itself, and once it goes, it all goes. And so what actually happened was after we had skied down as a group, the tail gunner came and skied across into this zone and caused the avalanche.
I pulled out my camera to take a picture of my husband skiing down the slope. I did not recognize that I was in a dangerous place. And when Dave yelled avalanche, it was sheer panic. I mean, I tried to grab my poles and get into the safety of the trees, which was literally meters away.
So everything from that point went into slow motion. I mean, I felt like I was pulling the word avalanche out of my mouth and wondering whether people were going to believe me, whether I was just pulling a prank.
It was 2 seconds later. I was down in the black, and it was dark and like being in a washing machine spinning around.
When I was hit with the avalanche, thankfully, I was probably only aware for about the next 3 or 4 seconds. I do not remember anything after that. I was unconscious and buried under the snow.
And then the avalanche kind of came to a slowing motion, and I knew I was underneath, it was dark. And then it moved again, and then it moved again, and it dumped me out. And I was lying on my back, and the bag had opened up behind me. It had knocked my helmet off.
Unfortunately, I was close to the top of the run skiing at the time of the avalanche being triggered above me. And quite honestly, I always thought I'd be able to ski out of a situation like this, but it quickly swept me away and funneled me down this chute.
This blast took me, and it wasn't even the snow, it was this percussion of air, this phenomenal blast took me and just shot me out of my skis into space. And then from then on, it was just, like a rag doll down the side of the mountain that lasted, it's really hard to say, but I'm thinking about 20 seconds. I went probably about 800-900 meters. And then miraculously, the snow around me starts to slow down, and I come around, land on my feet, and literally I walk out of the avalanche. And I'm stunned. And I'm facing the trees, skiers left, so I'm facing the trees, and time it has just stopped. My ski, well, for whatever reason, I lost all my equipment, but one of my skis was just windmilling through space in front of me in slow motion. And I watched it, I was mesmerized. And that probably was only about a second or two, but it was enough. And then I broke out of it, and I realized the situation I was in.
I'd have to say it's probably the most terrifying experience I've ever had. These avalanches move at incredibly high speeds, and I suspect I was over 100 kilometers an hour sliding with this snow. The fortunate part for me was I was able to fight it to the point that when it did come to a stop, I had slid hundreds of meters. I was partially buried, but I had my head above the surface. I could get myself out of the snow, and fortunately, I was unhurt.
I tore everything in my shoulder off. So when I got to the bottom, I had my right hand upside down. I had my head on the airbag, and I thought, oh my God, I'm alive. And so I went to take my pack off, and then I realized that my arm was hanging off the back of my neck.
Out of the 10 that were engulfed, 5 were fully buried at the bottom of the chute, and 5 were partially buried. They're running out of oxygen, and the rule of thumb is there's a much higher chance of survival if you can uncover somebody within 10 minutes. Our guide, because he was the furthest one down the slope skiing, he was able to react quickly with his transceiver and visual contact with certain burials. And then the rest of our group just slowly worked their way down and assisted in every which way we could.
So I pull out my transceiver, immediately go into search mode. By the time, about a minute later, I got a hit about 25 meters out. Within 20 minutes, we had 2 helicopter operations arrive. So we got the worst of our group out as quickly as possible.
It was a very efficient rescue, quite honestly. Our friend Doug Churchill was one of the last skiers to ski down to the regrouping spot just before the avalanche.
He was at the absolute worst place possible.
Doug is seriously injured, and so he's got to be airlifted out.
I remember being in the room. I remember asking the nurse, "Where is Doug? Why can't I see Doug?" And that's when I knew Doug was very, very seriously injured.
Doug was a great man. He was a good friend. He was an awesome father. He was a wonderful husband. I'm sure Sheila will tell you that they were soulmates. I mean, her whole life was centered around Doug.
I think I knew right from the very beginning when I first met Doug that here was my life partner. He was an amazing husband and a wonderful father. We went on so many adventures together as a family, hiking, canoeing, kayaking, down to our family cottage. We did a lot of things together as a family, and that's something that Doug really valued, was family time. He was the love of my life. He was always there to support me in no matter what I did. I had 39 years with Doug, and they were really happy years. I think the most shocking thing for me after reaching out to the group was understanding that there was a special public avalanche warning issued for that weekend, and that the guide had this special public avalanche warning, and he did not share it with our group. About a year and a half after the avalanche, I realized that the only way for me to make it through to the other side of this was to go right through the middle and learn as much as I could about what had happened that day. And it was at that point that we decided to lodge a formal complaint against our guide with the Association of Canadian Mountain Guides.
I can understand from having talked with people who have been through this what it's like to have gone through that kind of massive trauma. And so my heart just went out to everybody who was involved. And sadly, in those situations, because of the requirements of our insurance and our lawyers, the amount of communication that happens is really limited. So personally, it was really hard for me to have to sit back and not be able to reach out in the way that I really wanted to the people who suffered the most.
Through our complaint process, the ACMG has realized that it was an extremely flawed process, and they have already made a change to that procedure.
The genesis of this project, Backcountry Safe, came out of a very deep frustration where we were looking for justice.
After the incident, it was really clear to us that the ACMG had some pretty significant gaps in our critical incident protocols. And so, largely as a result of our interactions with the Churchill group, we have hired a group to provide some recommendations for us on revising our critical incident protocols.
We have many lessons learned from our incident, and we think it's just very valuable information to share with the greater community.
Well, first know yourself and be honest about your ability to ski in powder, your level of fitness, and your tolerance for risk.
And you have to know what's right, the difference between what's right and wrong, and when to speak out. That was my biggest failing. And I hear that from everybody in different ways, like feeling intimidated because you're at the back of the group and you don't want to let the group down.
I don't know why I wouldn't have expressed to somebody that I was uncomfortable. And I feel like that's something that I would have really learned in this process, that human dynamics are really something that you don't understand until you're in the moment.
So knowing yourself and then knowing your group, and what the alignment is to your expectations, and how the group dynamic works.
You have to talk to your group before you go. You have to have those open discussions about the objectives for the trip. And you have to be honest with yourself. Is this the group for you? Are you confident enough in yourself to say and step back and say, I shouldn't be there?
Well, I think it's really important when you talk to a guide, if they know the terrain that they're going into.
You should be comfortable asking your guide anything, and you should know that you've got a guide that's going to respond appropriately to whatever you ask.
Are they prepared to share their knowledge and some of the outcomes of their analysis, and do they encourage group discussion?
So what people should look for in a guide and with the types of questions that they should be asking revolve around the kind of experience that they want to have. So a guide is not a guide is not a guide.
You know what, if you've got somebody that just wants to ski as much as possible and somebody just wants to be out there to enjoy the day.
When you're in the mountains, you have to think about accommodating to the slowest person. You can't leave somebody behind. You die out there.
When a group is heading out for a day of backcountry skiing, they really need to gather all the appropriate information.
Before you step out of that lodge, talk to each other. What is your plan for the day? Has everybody got their safety gear on? Has everybody checked their safety gear? Does everybody know how to use their safety gear?
As a minimum, you need a transceiver and probe and shovel, but seriously consider communication devices beyond just a cell phone. Cell service may not be available to you. You might need good radio or sat phone communication with the outside world, because you will need help if you find yourself in an incident like ours. And then first aid kits and abundance of additional warm clothes for people.
You need to know the conditions. You need to review the Avalanche Canada bulletin for the conditions for that day, which we didn't know.
It's the responsibility of every guide to understand the nature of the conditions of where they're going. And so guides use a whole variety of resources to make that happen. They might check something called the Mountain Information Network, which is a platform that's run by Avalanche Canada. There is a platform, an internal platform that ACMG members have access to called the InformalX. And the InformalX often gives conditions reports. And if there isn't anything, then a guide who hasn't been following necessarily the conditions in a certain area would put out a request to other members saying, have you been into this area before? What have you observed? What do you see?
So understanding that, sharing that with the group, making a trip plan, but understanding what plan B looks like in case conditions aren't right, or if something happens to someone in the group, or the energy levels are such that the group wants to split into two.
And in guided situations, I do think it's hard for just one guide to manage a larger group of 12 or 13 people. And so in that situation, do you need two guides?
The other important thing is that particularly when you are wanting something more on the adventure side of things, is that it's really important for you as a member of the public to get some training as well.
I really encourage people to get out there and take their AST 1 and 2 courses, and possibly a first aid course, and practice.
When there's an incident, it's really important that somebody takes the lead. I mean, it could be anyone, whoever feels comfortable, whether they're in the right position, whether they've got the most knowledge, they're in the most calm state, because they need to be able to control the situation, to be able to spot for subsequent danger, to be able to deploy our resources.
Knowing what to do in the aftermath of an incident is extremely important, especially if you've got people in your group who have been buried.
Where you really need to understand how to use your technology, because you, in the new technology now, you can actually spot. Once you found someone, you can actually mark them. So then that signal is muted, and then you will then pick up the next closest signal. So understanding how to use the technology effectively, once you've marked and somebody is starting to recover, you can move on, because time is not your friend.
The avalanche that led to the spawning of the Backcountry Safe initiative had trauma with a double-edged sword to it. So there was clearly the trauma that occurred to the people who were involved in the avalanche. One person died. People were injured. And a guide is living his worst nightmare. But there's a secondary trauma. And the people who were involved faced a process with the ACMG that did not allow them to get the information that they needed to have in order to help them through. And I guess if I have a final message, it's that we at the ACMG regret that we didn't have the processes in place to be able to help them through that second side of the trauma. They had been through enough. They didn't need to have to deal with additional anger and frustration because they couldn't get what they needed to get.
It's a long journey to go through. We're doing it because it's the right thing to do. We know that this winter there are going to be a lot more people in the backcountry, and we need people to learn from our avalanche and our experience.
And so working with them now, collaborating with them on this Backcountry Safe initiative, and knowing that we are doing whatever we can to change those protocols is, in a way, it's cold comfort, but it's comfort. We are moving forward with them, and because of them. And in many ways, we are grateful to them for having pushed this initiative forward.
I think what I want everybody to remember is this is your life. You owe it to yourself to ask questions and take responsibility for your own actions. Doug was a man of his word, and Doug wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, but he always owned his mistakes, and he made amends. And I think he would see that we are doing the right thing here. We are owning our failings by not communicating properly with ourselves, with our group, with our guide. But we're owning that, and we're trying to move forward and prevent tragedies in other people's lives. He would be very much in support of what we are doing right now.